Look, I know, this video is a long one, but the scope blew up like a Kickstarter campaign that made 5 times its budget as I was making it. I started out trying to make a retrospective of Final Fantasy XIII, and ended up jumping down a rabbit hole that I had no idea existed. I think this stuff is really interesting, and chances are you do too, because according to my analytics, most of you are literally me. What I'm saying is, I recommend sticking around. I hope you do, at any rate. Now, let's get started. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Final Fantasy XIII is one of the most controversial Final Fantasies to ever release. Despite reviewing and selling well at the time, fan reception has been, let's say, not very kind to it, and it's pretty infamous within its series. I mean, it's the only mainline Final Fantasy not to receive a remaster of any kind on modern systems, having to settle for a half-assed PC port in 2014. It's also one of the only Final Fantasy games I hadn't played twice before this video, sharing that award with Final Fantasies II, V, and VIII. So, what am I doing here? Why make an extensive video retrospective of Final Fantasy XIII almost 12 years after its original release? In case you hadn't noticed the way I do things, I like to have a strong reason for choosing the games I go over. In the case of Final Fantasy XIII, it's because I've started to notice a trend of people treating this game more softly in recent years. That, and I'm gonna be real, I'm just not satisfied with the current state of criticism for the game. It usually starts and ends with it's linear so it's bad, or insert name of feature makes it not a Final Fantasy game, despite that feature probably also being in a previous Final Fantasy game. That just ain't gonna cut it for me, so I had to find out for myself. For the record, I played the game when it came out, and while it didn't blow my mind or anything, I didn't hate it. However, it was only like the 4th Final Fantasy game I'd played at that time. It was actually playing through 13 that made me decide to go through the entire series back to back starting from the first one, as I wanted to see what it could really offer. I'm like over a full decade away from those memories though, so I thought there's no better time than now to take another crack at it with my full adult brain. And I'm taking y'all with me, cause this is gonna be a trip. What started off as seeing if Final Fantasy XIII deserved a second chance ended up being a deep dive down into the inner workings of mid-2000s Square Enix that led to an existential crisis about what it even means to create a video game. Why is Final Fantasy VII Remake in the corner there, you ask? We're gonna get to that, trust me. Like usual, I'll go over the setting and some brief bits of story, but I'll give you an official warning before the spoilers start, so you're good there. With all that said, I want to get right to the good stuff, so let's jump in to Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII originally dropped on the brand new HD 7th generation consoles near the end of 2009, 2010 in the West. It might be an absolutely foreign concept nowadays, what with how notorious Square Enix is for doing this sort of thing, but Final Fantasy games didn't always used to come out a decade after their announcement. Up until the PS3 360 generation, they used to be pretty regular, with 3 mainline games per system from the NES to the PS2. Despite originally being planned as a PS2 title, Final Fantasy XIII released hot on the heels of 12, relatively speaking, with a gap of only 3.5 years separating them. Probably to show off the new hardware, the game opens up with a CGI cutscene featuring our main character Lightning taking out a bunch of armed soldiers on a train. She teams up with another main character, Saz, takes out the first boss, and the game begins properly. So, what's going on here? Final Fantasy XIII takes place on the floating world Cocoon, a shell-like structure that people live on the inside of. I'm just thinking it works something like Halo if you rounded the whole thing out. Cocoon stands in opposition to the lower world, Pulse. Both Cocoon and Pulse are inhabited by 2 races, the dominating godlike fal'Cie and the average everyday humans. Despite the power gap between them, both the fal'Cie and humans were created by the same maker and have coexisted with each other for thousands of years. Centuries before the start of the game, a few fal'Cie got the idea to create a paradise for humanity, free from the harsh everyday existence Pulse offered, and created Cocoon. While a few people were more than happy to take them up on the offer, many refused the plan and decided to remain. This would split the other race in 2, with the Cocoon fal'Cie and Pulse fal'Cie becoming 2 completely different entities, each working towards maintaining their own world. Tensions between the 2 worlds started to escalate when the Cocoon fal'Cie invaded Pulse for resources to build their shiny new Dyson Sphere. Cocoon and Pulse don't like each other, you see, with Pulse seeing Cocoon as evil and corrupt, and Cocoon seeing Pulse as hell on Earth. This would lead to a conflict known as the War of Transgression, with the Pulse fal'Cie and Cocoon fal'Cie throwing wrists at each other using their new tools, the l'Cie. Even though they were created by the same maker, fal'Cie have a sense of superiority over the humans. I mean, no shit, right? Kinda treating them like pets. Turning a human into a l'Cie is an extension of that. When a human's turned into a l'Cie, part of their body is branded with the l'Cie mark, and they have 2 options. Option 1 is to fail their orders, known as their focus, but doing so means that they'll be turned into a zombie-like husk, called a Seath. Sounds like a raw deal, but the next one's a lot better. Option 2 is to fulfill the fal'Cie's orders, upon which they'll be rewarded with eternal life, which actually means they're encased in crystal for all eternity. Did I say a lot better? I meant shit in a different way. Kind of a lose-lose, but if I had to pick one, I guess I'd go with being a Seath, because at least I could stick it to the normies as a zombie or something. l'Cie are the only people in this world that can use magic, and are basically given superpowers in order to carry out their fal'Cie's will. You might have noticed something in that explanation. l'Cies are a trope reversal of the Warrior of Light thing Final Fantasy I started. Being branded a Warrior of Light signifies that you're a chosen hero going on a divine mission. Same with being branded a l'Cie, technically. The only difference is, while fal'Cie and l'Cie who drink the Kool-Aid think becoming a l'Cie is a divine honor or something, from an outside perspective, like a player, you can see it's a pretty raw deal. Clever play on a common RPG trope there. The war transgression ended when a pulse l'Cie turned into the mythical beast Ragnarok, attacking Cocoon and damaging the outer shell, but failing to destroy it completely. The war would end, and the situation quieted down in the years that followed, but the citizens of Cocoon were terrified of anything that had to do with Pulse, worried that one day they would try to invade again. Afterwards, to repair the floating continent, the Cocoon fal'Cie would do the thing that in no way went horrible last time, and use raw materials taken from Pulse. These raw materials were known as vestiges, which were mostly thought to be harmless curiosities from another world. The events of our game take place when the Pulse fal'Cie anima is discovered in one of these vestiges. In response to this, the government immediately quarantined off the city where the vestige was discovered, and announced it would purge the people in it to the lower world of Pulse, a move heavily supported by the Pulse-fearing population. Our main characters Lightning, Saz, Snow, Vanille, and Hope all find themselves wrapped up in this purge for one reason or another, and through their individual circumstances, mostly through the attempted rescue of Lightning's sister and Snow's fiancée Sarah, they all end up in the vestige where they come face to face with the Pulse fal'Cie. There's also one more character, Fang, but we'll talk about her later. They're turned into Pulse l'Cie by Anima and are given their option: destroy Cocoon or be turned into Seath. Now, I don't know about you fellas, but I found the backstory for this world and the setup to the plot to be really interesting. The idea of these god creatures using humanity to settle their grudges like an alternate universe Pokemon battle, as well as the inherent hopelessness that comes with being a l'Cie, paints the picture of a world that hangs on a fragile balance. And that world building only gets better as the game goes along, which we'll talk about. It uses its shiny techno-future aesthetic as a facade. It never outright says it's a nightmare world taking place in the literal end times. You gotta connect those dots yourself. You'll get a better sense of this when I talk about spoilers near the end, so just keep it in mind for now. It's a bit early to get into criticism, but you might be wondering how I know all this backstory about the world. A common complaint levied at Final Fantasy XIII is that there's a dedicated section in the menu called the Datalog where all this information is hidden. Instead of telling you through the story, the game expects you to go through the Datalog to untangle the lore, like you're reading Dark Souls item descriptions to find out why a boss wears a funny hat. Part of this review involved me going to a bunch of different places where complaints are posted, so I can get multiple perspectives to understand where each is coming from. Trying to be as fair as I can here. I don't think this one has too much weight to stand on. My main case is, well, I haven't read the Datalog. At least not past the extent of getting footage for it, and I was still able to tell you all that about the world. I can remember the conversations the characters have in-game explaining this stuff, and some dedicated people have made compilations of screenshots documenting exactly when this backstory is told throughout the game. What I will say, though, is that when there's smoke, there's fire. And you could say that backstory being presented out of order through characters' conversations is a flawed way to convey it, and you might not be wrong about that. This is my second playthrough of the game, and I beat it in about 10 days this time around, not leaving big play gaps for me to forget about plot details. So I will say that I'm more well-versed in the world than your average player is. Even if that's the case, everything is organized by category in the Datalog with extra detail should you want to use it. I don't think it hurts the game with its inclusion, at the very least. I think this myth is busted, but don't you worry, we'll be going over a lot more criticism before this video's up. Speaking of contentious topics, let's talk about Final Fantasy XIII's gameplay. I don't think the active time battle system needs any introduction, but 13's version of it feels kinda like stepping into an alternate universe where Hiroyuki Ito, the creator of the system, veered left instead of right. You got this ATB bar that's slowly filling up in sections, and you can queue up commands to execute so long as you have the necessary meter. Your ATB bar starts with 2 segments, but it'll get longer as the game goes on, for example, gaining a third when your characters become a l'Cie. You can wait for it to fill up to max, or you can press a button to execute the actions you currently have listed. Now, that's all in theory. In practice, Final Fantasy XIII moves fast, and the cursor defaults to an auto-battle button that you'll be tempted to smash that'll usually fill up your queue with the most appropriate commands for the situation. Key word there, usually. I know what you're thinking, just don't use it. And I'd agree, but it just sits there, tempting you, begging you for that click. Your characters usually have so many attack options, and the ATB bar fills up so quickly that filtering through to manually select them will end up with you sitting with a full ATB bar as you scroll down the list choosing attacks. Honestly, it's pretty lame that 9 times out of 10, hitting auto battle is the optimal way to play. Similar to Final Fantasy XII, you only directly control your lead character in battle, but unlike in that game, you can't issue the others commands directly. They'll be doing their own thing, and roll through the same commands your auto battle would have chosen for you in that situation. This was a design decision likely made because manually queuing commands for one character was tough enough. Doing it for all 3 would need you to move like one of them professional StarCraft players. With all that said, you might be thinking, how does Final Fantasy XIII's battle system involve strategy when 80% of it is automated? Well, that's where the game's defining feature, the paradigm system, comes into play. The game has 6 roles: Commando, your standard damage dealer; Ravager, your magic user; Synergist, your support spellcaster; Saboteur, the debuff specialist; Medic, the healer of the group; and Sentinel, the tank. You set up paradigms using a different combination of these roles, and you can freely switch between them during battle. You're required to switch up your strategy so often because of a mechanic you might know if you played Final Fantasy VII Remake, the stagger system. Unlike in 7 Remake, the stagger system in 13 isn't a binary on-off thing. Enemies take damage according to the multiplier in the stagger bar until they break, at which point you can wail on them as that number climbs higher and higher. You can also launch them into the air, which has the advantage of making it so they can't attack you. There's this cool little metagame you can do where you're timing your attacks to juggle them for as long as possible. About that stagger bar, Ravagers will build it up quickly, but you need commandos to stop it from depleting. Thing is, you can't just be on full blast at all times, you'll get smoked. In Final Fantasy XIII, there's a big emphasis on controlling the battle. You want to maintain your control of it at all times using the paradigm system. If you get tunnel vision and go gorilla brain on the enemies for too long, your control of the situation will slip, at which point you have to switch to a full defensive paradigm until you can wrestle that control back. This all folds back into how Final Fantasy XIII handles its difficulty. You see, previous Final Fantasy game encounters aren't really difficult in a vacuum. The difficulty comes from a constant balance of resources as you trudge along a dungeon or a world map. If you use your strongest spells for every fight, yeah, sure, you'd wipe the enemy out in seconds, but you'd run out of MP or any other resource by the time you reach the boss. On the other hand, if you save your MP and only use regular attacks, the enemies have more opportunities to get hits in, which means you have to spend your healer's MP or use items to patch up. You're constantly walking a line to make sure you can get through an area before you hit empty. My favorite example of this is Mount Gagazet from Final Fantasy X. It's a long trek through a mountain pass where each individual encounter isn't overly difficult, but you go so long without a chance to refuel, you feel like you're stretching every character to the limit. It gives a great sense of accomplishment and relief when you finally push through to the other side. In Final Fantasy XIII, your characters heal to full after every battle, and MP isn't a limited resource, so to create difficulty, most enemy encounters have a good chance to kill you. You're required to engage with the paradigm system, otherwise a random encounter with some jobbers can leave you on that game over screen. Something that probably won't happen in a lot of other games in the series, unless you have an out-of-body experience mid-battle or something. I'm more on the side of the prior games in the series, but putting all this together means that 13 does manage to keep you paying attention for at least, 50% of its fights. This also rolls into how money and weapons are handled. In previous Final Fantasy games, gil is something I'm going to term as a primary resource. You need gil. You can't beat the game without it. It's essential to getting better equipment and items. In Final Fantasy XIII, the vast majority of weapons and accessories are obtained naturally as you progress. You could probably do some kind of challenge playthrough where you finish the game without spending a single piece of gil and not even suffer for it. Enemies don't even drop gil in this game. At best, they drop an item that you can sell for gil. You can skate around this whole gil thing because in Final Fantasy XIII, you don't really get better weapons. Each weapon is kinda like a side grade to the others. They all have their own unique passive ability, but they all get more powerful by upgrading them. Of course, the most efficient way to obtain these upgrade items is to spend a bit of hard cash, but you get plenty from monster drops as well. Similarly to most other design decisions made by the game so far, it's not an inherently bad mechanic, it's just kinda weird, and tough to swallow at first. You can tell that this mechanic was made to, quote, fix a perceived problem with the RPG genre. Other Final Fantasy games usually have you switching out weapons pretty regularly, and you do sometimes run into the issue that the weapon with the ability you want can't compete damage-wise with a new weapon you found. Even when you do find a weapon that provides the ability you want with a competitive damage output, you'll likely be throwing it away for a new one in about an hour. 13's solution does technically solve that problem, but its design kinda encourages you to pick a single weapon and stick with it. You can choose equipment optimally tailored around preparing for a certain boss fight, but the game's encounter and drop rate is balanced around you being able to properly maintain about one weapon per character. Of course, the best way to better prepare for fights in Final Fantasy games is to level up and get stronger. And it's here 13 introduces its bootleg version of the sphere grid from 10, the Crystarium. You know how this goes. After every battle you earn EXP in the form of Crystarium points. You can then cash those points in the Crystarium. Each of your character's available roles is listed, and you can spend the points in the different trees for abilities and stat boosts. The Crystarium is a lot more linear than the Sphere Grid. You only usually have a straight track with a few offshoots, but you can choose which roles to prioritize and spend your points in for a bit of variety. Look, I don't know how to describe it, but despite its simplicity, there's something mesmerizing about the cycle of fighting enemies, earning EXP, and slowly building up each character's Crystarium. There's also nothing better than the dopamine hit you get when you save up a massive amount and then dump it all at the same time. Basically, the Final Fantasy equivalent to dumping boiled chicken and protein shakes down your characters' throats. 13 also gets an award for Smart Fucking Decision of the Year by giving your characters EXP equally whether they participated in battle or not. This means that you can freely swap between characters whenever you want, and you're not completely screwed when the game forces you to use a certain set of benchwarmers. It should be important to note that you don't get access to the paradigms until Chapter 3, and prior to that, the battle system makes a terrible first impression. For the first 2 chapters, your characters basically have 2 options, a single attack for single targets or an area attack for groups. The auto battle won't do a perfect job at choosing the right one, so I guess most of the strategy in these early hours is knowing when to queue up the area attacks for max efficiency. The problem is, Chapter 1 is like 5 one-on-one boss fights, where your only option is to press the attack button for minutes at a time. There's no ambiguity for the auto battle button here, so you're hitting the same button over and over. It gets to the point where you want to get up and do the dishes or something, just for a little bit of stimulation. Combine this with the fact that your characters don't gain EXP until Chapter 3, and it's understandable why the well was poisoned for a lot of people at the start. You can feel the game wasting your time. It does get better once you clear that first hurdle, but man, who was sitting there thinking, yeah, that's good, ship it? One other issue is that for the first third or so of the game, your party members are paired up in 2s. This is great for character development and interaction, but in a game with 3 party members, you're basically out 33% of your available strategy. It's stuff like this where I can see why most people regard the first 10 hours of this game as a tutorial. The battle system has merits, and I'm willing to give credit where credit is due, but you spend quite a while without the ability to use it to its full potential. If you do manage to push the battle system to its full potential, you'll notice that Final Fantasy XIII has a ranking system. Because I guess why not add a feature that's mostly found in character action games?
What the hell is this?
While I don't care too much about its existence personally, what's interesting about a ranking system is what it ranks you on. Better put, what does Final Fantasy XIII consider to be optimal play? Well, I hope you weren't expecting much, because it literally just ranks you on your battle time with a small multiplier for a preemptive attack using some arbitrary formula based on the enemies you fought and the number of them. You could wipe this whole screen out the game except for the part where it tells you how much EXP you earned and lose nothing from the experience. Also, this is kind of a nitpick. While I'm not usually too bothered about not being able to move your characters in battle, I can't describe to you how many times my sentinel would plant their ass beside the medic, draw the enemies towards them, and then the medic would get hammer-fisted to death by association. It's really not a bad battle system, it just could have been improved so much with a few minor tweaks. In fact, you can say that about pretty much everything I just mentioned about the gameplay. It's not perfect, some of the design is questionable, but I don't think that makes it terrible. It was clear that they were trying to tackle a lot of perceived issues with the RPG genre when designing 13. There's nothing here that I'd say changed the future of role-playing games as we know them, but there's nothing I can condemn as actual garbage either. It's a series of experiments that are honestly not bad for a first pass at changing the formula. I know it's not staggering praise to be like, well, at least it's not complete garbage. But a decade later, you can appreciate the effort that was put in to innovate the RPG genre that wasn't just the standard, make it an action game solution that most developers do today. As time's passed, we've seen most big RPGs go for an action game hybrid route, with a split between them and traditional style games. Final Fantasy XIII was trying to innovate within the genre, and while you could argue that's a good or bad thing, during that generation of consoles, a lot of people weren't confident that the turn-based RPG was going to survive the passage of time. Hindsight 2020, we've got some really good traditional style RPGs coming out nowadays, but outlooks for the future were way different in 2009. Final Fantasy XIII's innovations weren't exactly received warmly. I'd say a non-insignificant factor in that, though, was many people were worried that this was the direction that RPGs were going to take from now on, or at the very least, the direction Final Fantasy games were going to take from now on. We know now that's not the case, but it was a legitimate worry at the time. One thing about Final Fantasy XIII that was true in 2009 and remains true now is that the game looks really good visually. Yeah, there are some things that stick out and remind you that you're not playing a modern game. The hair looks kinda wacky, there's some muddy textures, and I can't get the image of the character's terrifying sausage fingers out of my mind. Like, seriously, what was it about the fingers that they just couldn't get it done right? Ugh, I don't like that. But with the resolution and frame rate bumped up on the PC version, you can kinda squint your eyes and forget you're playing a game from literally 12 years ago. I'm really surprised with how well it holds up now, but just imagine how hard it set the standards at the time. The environments are well detailed, varied, and colorful. There was clearly a lot of effort put into making each area look unique, and I can only really call out a few that fall below par. The character designs are some of-the-time JRPG protagonists that look like they were specifically made to be someone's favorite character, but I can't say they look bad. It's also kinda cool how they're physically present with your lead character on the map outside of battle. Due to the technology of the time, previous Final Fantasy games just had the other characters slide out of your main one whenever a battle starts, like some kind of twink matryoshka. That being said, the AI's pathfinding could use a little more work. Either that, or I think the pressure finally got to Saz. The facial expressions and mouth movements look a little wonky, since this was before using mocap was a regular thing for video games, but again, kids who were like 4 when this game came out can legally drink in most of Europe. The CG scenes though, god damn. These still look incredible, and the animation is near perfection. Square Enix was top of the industry in this stuff, and it really shows. This might be a foreign concept to most people nowadays, but for a good while, CG cutscenes like these were kinda like a reward for playing the game. Don't get me wrong, I dislike when monotonous cutscenes drag on as well, but whenever the screen went dark in Final Fantasy IX and you could hear the disc start spinning to load up an FMV, you knew you were in for a good time. One hill I will die on is the music in this game slaps, and I won't have anyone tell me otherwise. Look, I get it, Nobuo Uematsu transcended humanity. His music is, and always will be #1, and I wish I could hear his version of the game's score as well. But this game's composer, Masashi Hamauzu, studied closely under Uematsu for almost a decade, and was even brought into Square by the man himself. That's a good enough resume for me. Once you accept the fact that the composer is different, you can really start to appreciate the way the music itself is different, in a good way. Hamauzu is a classically trained pianist, and a lot of that shines through in 13's tracks, which are a lot more heavily piano-focused than previous games in the series. You've got a fantastic battle theme that slowly swells up before reaching a crescendo, the calm, gentle melody of the main theme, and I don't know what a sunlit waterscape is, but I'm into it.
Are you winning, son?
Some main themes are repurposed a few too many times, but that's not always a bad thing. For example, Lightning's theme includes elements of the battle theme, but the instruments used and the way they're played end up creating a song with a totally different mood. It turns a bombastic hype theme into a track with a hopeful yet somber tone, perfect for a character who struggles to justify her choices. This video will obviously be full of Final Fantasy XIII's music, so pay attention to some of the background tracks and tell me what you think about it. Other than the music, the sound effects are pretty standard, but I do have one weird issue to bring up. There are these pre-rendered cutscenes that are somewhere between an in-model one and a CG one. For some reason, the audio during them sounds like it's being played through a Discord call or something. I'll play a few seconds for you to listen to, see if you get what I mean. Hopefully, YouTube doesn't compress the audio so much it's not noticeable and I just sound like a crazy person.
だったら敵同士かよ。
お前たちともそうなるかもな。
絶望にとらわれてみんなバラバラだったからライトニングの苦しみを。
Audio foibles aside, the game has an attention to detail that's really strong. This is one of those games where you can really tell that some of the development team got their jobs done before the others and just spent the rest of the time polishing. We're almost there, just a little more. For example, there's this neat little animation that plays for each character and slowly fades out whenever you enter their status screen. Reminder, this was almost a full decade before Persona 5. The characters' LaCie brands subtly change over the course of the game, signifying that they're running out of time. Speaking of running out of time, Seath are really creepy when you're first introduced to them. They make these unnerving noises and attack by just kind of flailing at you. My favorite thing though is that they're some of the only enemies that can use items in battle. Let that sink in for a sec. They still use items like people, as if they're holding on to some shred of humanity. Damn. That was a nice touch from the gameplay designers. I also mentioned how most characters start off with 2 ATB charges, and gain a third when they become a LaCie. However, prior to that in chapters 1 and 2, Vanille already has 3 ATB charges, foreshadowing that there might be a little more going on there. The game also does something incredibly smart by making you face enemies that put up a tough fight for you in Chapter 2 prior to becoming a lessee in Chapter 3 as well, and you absolutely stomp them. It uses gameplay to hit home that despite the fal'Cie essentially condemning you to 2 different flavors of die, you've become so much more powerful than you were previously. Since that's a good enough transition for me to start talking about the main characters, let's go a little deeper into our party. Most Final Fantasies are about a group of very different people uniting under a single goal, but it's pretty clear in the early hours that the cast of Final Fantasy XIII are not friends, just a bunch of people in the same unfortunate circumstance. They argue, they fight, and they eventually split up since they each have their own idea about what's the best way to solve their problem. Lightning dislikes Snow because she's always put on a cold, tough front to protect her sister Sarah. Then Snow shows up, Sarah gets turned into a lessee, they announce they're getting married, and all hell breaks loose. Yeah, it's no secret why these two don't see eye to eye. Saz is just some normal dude trying to do right by his kid who's been detained by the government. So when Lightning shows up on his purge train, he sticks to her as his best bet for escape, but he gets frustrated when he realizes she'll drop him at the first chance she gets. Snow likes the idea of being a hero, but quickly comes to the realization that he's unable to handle the responsibility that comes along with it. Vanille puts on a happy front, but in reality, she's slowly being crushed by the weight of the guilt she has for the things that she's done.
All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain.
Hope is 14 years old and has had everything taken away from him, and he believes he knows who's to blame. He struggles with that desire for revenge, slowly turning him into a person that he's not. These characters are very clearly not perfect people. They're flawed, bitter, and untrusting. It's by accepting these flaws that they grow to overcome the challenges placed before them. A lot of this is done through an appointment with their personal therapists, their Eidolons, creatures that appear to lessee when they're on their breaking points, and this game's version of summons. After defeating an Eidolon in a sort of puzzle boss fight, you can use them in battle. Yeah, no, I don't think I want to talk about how Saz's turns into a literal car. Hold up. Does that say Gestalt? By confronting their Eidolons in battle, our characters gain the resolve to overcome their faults and keep pushing forward. Wait, wrong game. Now, the question is, do a lot of these character moments hit the mark? Some more than others. I'll give you an example. It's not really spoilers since it happens in the first half hour of the game, but Snow is like a little bit responsible for Hope's mother's death. Let's set the stage. He's got a hold of her as they're hanging off a broken bridge, but she asks him to drop her and protect her son, who he doesn't know is Hope at the time. Snow loses his grip, and she falls into the abyss below, with Hope looking on from afar, only being able to see Snow dropping his mom. While Hope originally just wants to ask Snow to explain what happened, he eventually lets the feelings stew until he wants to get revenge on Snow for what he sees as murder. See, the thing is, while I was watching the scene with Snow and Hope's mom, I was thinking how it would play out better if, say, he was holding onto her on the edge and then a ship showed up and starts firing at them. This would put Snow in a situation where he could continue to hold onto her knowing that they both might fall, or drop her and make his escape. Really hammering home how his ideals of being a hero for his own ego leads to other people getting hurt, which is a main component in his character development. This isn't what happens though. We see Snow literally doing everything in his power to save Hope's mom. Even at the point she lets go of him and is actively trying to fall, he does everything he can to try and lift her back up. The thing is, the game continues as if he dropped her to save himself. Snow continues as if he dropped her to save himself. You could argue that it's Snow's interpretation of the events, but it kinda doesn't feel like that. It feels like the game's writing doesn't match with what previously happened, and I think I have a good idea as to why that is. The way this game was written was pretty ass backwards, at least for the first 8 chapters. Final Fantasy XIII director Matomu Toriyama wrote most of the plot and characters in the early stages of the game. A few years into development, writer Daisuke Watanabe joined the staff. Toriyama basically had the events of the plot hammered out, but needed Watanabe to fill in how those events happened. He provided Watanabe with a rough outline, but basically threw him a used color-by-numbers picture book. While Toriyama had his own vision for the characters, Watanabe had to make some changes in order to put the pieces together. The end result is it kind of feels like you have 2 people playing tug-of-war regarding how the story unfolds. You don't notice it a lot of the time, but when it sticks out, you can really feel it. I don't have any proof of this next statement, but let's use that last Snow-Hope situation as an example. It kinda feels like Toriyama wrote something along the lines of, Snow causes Hope's mom to die. Then when Watanabe's filling in the plot, he says something like, that doesn't sound very in character for Snow, and makes it as much not Snow's fault as he can. The thing is, we're still following Toriyama's plot structure, so eventually mismatches start to show up, resulting in this whole tug-of-war feeling. Alright, it's time to take on the big daddy of Final Fantasy XIII criticism. It's linearity. The game's main sticking point for a lot of people is that it's linear, it's a hallway, it plays itself, etc, etc. Let's get into this a little bit. Being the first Final Fantasy for HD systems, the team struggled to make open environments like they did for the previous entries. The game justifies this by making it a Final Fantasy game where your characters are always on the run, being unable to return to areas you've already visited. Being pulseless sea fugitives, the gang can't exactly make a pit stop at the nearest spoons for a pint, so towns, a series staple, were also cut. This is immediately noticeable when you first start playing the game, and you realize save points are also where you're going to be doing all your shopping, like it's some corporate dystopian future Amazon kiosk. How does this design translate to the map layouts? I'll throw up a few clips of map screens so you can get an idea of what we're talking about here, but here's my take. It's linear, there's no denying that, but I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to call it a hallway. There are definitely a lot of maps that can be considered a hallway, but for every cherry-picked example of that, there's a cherry-picked example of one that isn't. I think it's an agreeable point that Final Fantasy XIII pre-Chapter 11 is about as linear as Final Fantasy X is, and I don't see that game getting crucified for that. The question of whether linearity is inherently bad game design is a complex one, and it's a topic that many people are likely to have differing opinions over. I hope, though, that after the flood of subpar open-world checkbox mission climb tower reveal map games of the 2010s, we've gotten past the more open equals better game mentality. Open or linear, a game should be designed to complement the format it chooses. What I will say on a personal note is that while I'm not a fan of open-world checkbox mission list games, I think the Final Fantasy series, as well as most other RPGs in general, had struck a good balance in design with previous entries. Let's take Final Fantasy VII as an example. You start off the game in an area that's not too unlike 13's chapters 1 to 10, before venturing out into the open world. From that point on, dungeons do take you down a semi-linear path, but you're always swapping between open and closed level designs. 13 lacks that balance. It's either always on or always off, and I think that's a big factor as to why the game feels as restrictive as it does. I will say that I don't think they needed to commit this hard to the concept. Areas like Palimpolum and Nautilus have clear moments of quiet time where there are no enemies and you can just walk around. The problem is, there's nothing really to do here. Would it have been that hard to implement a physical version of some save point shops here and there? A few NPCs to talk to? An inn that you can stay at that would obviously have no purpose for healing your character's health, but maybe we could get an optional cutscene where Lightning asks Hope if he likes crepes or something? Just anything, you know? I know this is a symptom of a troubled development cycle, but it really does hurt the game overall. There's two areas where you can just walk around and interact with things in the environment to learn more about them, and honestly, doing so kinda felt like coming up for air. The game plays like this except for a single chapter, which, to be fair, is the longest chapter, accounting for about 40% of my total playtime, and contains almost all of the side content. Now, look, I'm gonna be a big enough person to admit that I was full of shit. You might have heard the common complaint that Final Fantasy XIII only gets good 20 hours in. They're talking about Chapter 11, which takes place on Pulse, and it's the first truly open area of the game. Sorry for another Final Fantasy X comparison, but prior to my replay of the game for this video, I used to disagree. I'd say, it's just a boring circle-shaped area. That's like saying Final Fantasy X only gets good at the Calmlands. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking either. I was on Pulse for like a grand total of 3 minutes before I realized how full of shit I was. While I do disagree with the statement that the game only gets good 20 hours in, since I don't think the previous, for the record, 15 hours it took me to get to Pulse was bad, it really does turn into a whole different game. That's not hyperbole. It literally felt like something completely different. Pulse has an absolutely massive open area, with side areas that interconnect with each other. Seriously, it takes literal minutes to walk from one end of the Arclight step to the other. You also don't have a single path to go down. You can generally explore wherever you want. The game won't arbitrarily gate you off from areas. If you're strong enough to beat the monsters there, it's fair game. There are optional cutscenes you can see in any order, depending on the order you tackle the different areas. You get side quests which are honestly not that compelling plot-wise, but they offer a good excuse to fight new enemies and get stronger. This chapter is like a full 2 or 3 points better on a 10-point scale than the rest of the game. I know realistically the whole game couldn't be like this, but it's a shame that more of it wasn't. Toriyama would justify the linear game design at first, saying it was just Westerners complaining because they were used to more open games. And, I don't know, what was an open game at the time? Like, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion or something? And, like, my dude, what? That is some premium copium you got going on there. It was quickly becoming clear that something else was happening behind the scenes. So, what was going on? What happened here? Well, before I go over the last bits of story and the ending of the game, it's finally time to talk about the elephant in the room. Jak and Daxter, Ratchet & Clank, Square Enix 10 years ago in botched development cycles. Name a more iconic pair. I don't think any studio was more notorious for long development cycles than Square Enix was. Final Fantasy XV, Kingdom Hearts 3, it used to be the case that if Square Enix announced something, there was a good chance you wouldn't be seeing it for a decade. It might surprise you to know this, but despite Final Fantasy XII releasing on the ass end of the PS2's lifespan, 13 was originally meant to release on the system as well. Switching to the PS3 likely created a lot of hurdles for the team, but one thing you gotta remember about this console generation is that developers loved making entire engines from the ground up for a new game. Final Fantasy XIII was gonna run on Square Enix's brand new in-house Crystal Tools engine. Okay, but this doesn't necessarily have to be a death sentence, right? Square Enix is a big studio with hundreds of talented developers. Surely they can handle it. And I hear you, I hear what you're saying, but what if they did their best to make it a death sentence, huh? In what must have been an internal mandate for bad decisions, this engine also needed to be flexible enough to support a bunch of very different games as well. Remember Fabula Nova Crystallis? Yeah, it felt like the games that eventually released in that Curse series wanted nothing to do with it by the time they came out. Crystal Tools needed to not only support Final Fantasy XIII, but the entire Fabula Nova Crystallis lineup and Final Fantasy XIV at the same time. That means this engine needed to work with a trilogy of 13 games, 14, 15, and Type 0, and it all had to get done in order to push 13 out just a few years after 12. And after doing a bit of extra digging, it turns out it had to support Dragon Quest X as well, because, I mean, why not at this point? Yeah, talk about a tall order. The clock was ticking, and despite development for 13 going on for years at this point, the team didn't have much to show for it, and eventually, they had to shove something out the door. This led to a lack of unified vision for the project, where they just threw manpower at it to make it in time for the release date. In particular, this game had a lot of artists, and I mean a lot of artists. Disclaimer, I'm not too familiar with the optimal staff composition of development teams, but in a team consisting of just over 200 people, 180 of them were artists. One art director, Isamu Kamikokuryo, said they had enough cut content to make a full nother game. Something that to me says, we went through most of the development not knowing what we wanted this to be. The team at Square Enix also had a desire to keep this game secret. This was a brand new entry in a world-renowned series after all. It was a secret so well kept that they, forgot to tell the playtesters until the final stretch of the game's development. This means they couldn't implement any of the feedback the playtesters gave. Not to mention, they took the poison, we want to appeal to Western audiences pill. Honestly, anyone else notice that Japanese games got a lot better once they stopped trying to appeal to a certain audience and just went back to making good games? Basically, Final Fantasy XIII was hindered by a rushed development cycle and a lack of outside opinions on what would make the game good. Too many decisions were made by too few people, and ultimately, the game suffered for it. But there was something else. It feels weird talking about a bad localization in a game from 2009. Look, I have immense respect for localizers. It's a tough job that a lot of people don't fully grasp the difficulty of, because they think it's just turn Japanese words into English words. It's well known that the Final Fantasy series has had an unfortunate history of poor localizations, especially 7, but this was a case of the attitude at the time. Pre the year 2000, no one really considered how much work localization required, so translation staff were usually paid in pennies and given 3 weeks to localize hundreds of pages of script. But we passed that point a long time ago, right? How can Final Fantasy XIII possibly have a bad localization? Especially after Final Fantasy XII was specifically recognized as being a high point for localization in video games. Look, I don't go out of my way to find bad localizations, I swear they find me, but we got a big one here. Because of the way the game was constantly cutting and adding content during development, the script would be translated and the English voice lines recorded, only to have the rug ripped out from under their feet a week later. I was playing with Japanese audio and English subtitles, so it was really easy to pick out a ton of cases where the two would be saying something completely different. I'll give you one notable example of something that stuck out to me. It's a scene about 2 hours into the game with Snow and Sarah watching the fireworks. Remember, Sarah is a lessee who's probably only got a few days left to live at this point. She sees the fireworks and remarks to Snow it's like our own private heaven. Snow replies, let's see them together next year too. Snow's determination takes Sarah by surprise. She cries and the two kiss. There's a lot of emotion in this scene. Despite Snow not being a lessee by this point, and by all means should be Sarah's enemy, this line implies that he's sticking by her and will do whatever it takes to free her from her fate, committing to see the fireworks next year. This isn't some untranslatable mythical Japanese concept, so I was confused when the English script was changed to All I Need Is You.
秘密の場所だね。
来年もここで見よう。
Why would that make Sarah cry? It only made sense once I realized that it was likely the original Japanese script probably did say that at some point and was changed later. The entire English voiceover was re-recorded, wait for it, 5 full times during localization. They were also provided with the bare minimum resources when doing the localization, because of the whole this game is top secret so y'all ain't getting the details thing. So entire character personalities were lost in transition. The translators were basically just given a piece of paper with the dialogue on it. They weren't shown the scene that contained the, important context of how everything played out until a much later date. Then, once the voice director finally saw the scene and directed the actors, it was highly likely said scene would end up being changed on the Japanese side, which means they would have to fly blind again. As a result, you get things like lightning being far more emotive in the Japanese version. Okay, future me here coming to tell you a fun fact while editing. I just looked it up, and it turns out Lightning's last name, Farron, means thunder. Yeah, that's right, Lightning's name means lightning thunder. I am going to lose my goddamn mind. A lot of people say Vanille, whose name is Vanilla, in Japanese by the way, is an annoying, unlikable character, but I didn't think that at all during my playthrough. Edgy Hope is just as bad in both languages though. There's this one thing with Snow's gang that makes me slam my palm into my forehead every time I think about it. You see, Snow's gang is called Nora. This is meant to be important because Hope's mother's name is also Nora. Nora in the gang is short for Noraneko, which in Japanese means stray cat. Snow's crew was full of people who didn't really have anywhere else to go for one reason or another, so they stuck with each other. I guess it was decided that this was too radical of a pun for the side of the globe that invented Gears of War to understand, but how do you change it without losing the double meaning of it being Hope's mom's name? Well, for the Western release of Final Fantasy XIII, they changed Nora to stand for no obligations, rules, or authorities. Like, what? What? Not only does this make my sides cringe into orbit, it changes them from a group of misfits just trying to stick by each other to some gang of cool kids who don't listen when their parents tell them to stop playing Quake 64 at 10 PM on a school night. Lightning is right when she calls it a stupid acronym. Now don't get me wrong, I can appreciate that the localizers were caught between a rock and a hard place having to bring over a pun that was made for another language. But man, that's an L, I'll tell you that for free. The English localization director and the Japanese sound engineer were both pretty quick to realize that shit was on fire, but it was too late to course correct. The damage was already done. The best they could do was to make sure that this wouldn't happen in future games. Now, there is one more thing about this game I have to mention. None of this is concrete, it's all my opinion, but it's a pattern I've noticed the deeper I researched into Final Fantasy XIII's development. If you've watched a few of my videos, you'll know I don't like speculation, so I wouldn't be dropping this take unless I was reasonably sure of it. The further down the rabbit hole I got, the more this started to make sense, so I'm going to share this take with you. I think that Final Fantasy VII Remake had a negative impact on Final Fantasy XIII. Now, before you haul me off to the town dump for saying a game that wouldn't exist for another 10 years impacted this one, hear me out. I'm gonna flash the core staff for a few Final Fantasy games on the screen. See if you can notice any similarities. Got it? That's right, the same team that made Final Fantasy XIII also made VII Remake. This is further confirmed in this chart by user Bring Peanut Butter on Twitter. For now, I want you to forget all about the other teams and think only about ours truly over here. Looking at this, we can tell that VII Remake isn't actually a sequel to 15. It's best considered as a sequel to 13. When people say VII Remake is an improved, more action-focused iteration on 15's gameplay, it isn't. It's an iteration on 13's. When people say it feels random that the stagger mechanic from 13 made its way to VII Remake, it's not really. It's the same staff putting the same mechanic they came up with for a game they made directly beforehand into a new one. This may be a pull, but to me, the inclusion of the stagger system in VII Remake is like the developers leaning into my ear and saying, see, we had good ideas. Now we're gonna put it in a game you want so you're forced to like it. Arguably, of all the Final Fantasy games ever to release, the two most similar games are 13 and VII Remake. I mean, 7 Remake has more in common with 13 than it does with OG 7. I hosted a poll about people's favorite Final Fantasy game way back, and 7 Remake was the winner. While you and I both know that this is mostly because it's the latest one to come out, it really makes you think that the difference in reception between 7 Remake and 13 is literally running the spectrum of best to worst. Now obviously, there's a ton of things the games do differently. Saying they're the exact same is like taking an apple and an orange and going, ah yes, fruit. But with the same core staff, same chapter-based linear structure with occasional open areas where you do side missions, same stagger system, same AI-controlled party members, and hell, even the Crystarium system made a triumphant return, you can see that there's a clear parallel between the two games. This isn't ragging on 7 Remake. Like I've said throughout this video, I think a lot of 13's changes were good on paper, even if maybe not the best when actually executed. I'm trying to raise 13 up, not bring 7 Remake down. But putting that aside for a second, for all this to make sense, we have to establish why 13 and 7 Remake have this tethered relationship in the first place. To set the stage, demand for Final Fantasy VII Remake was at an apex during this time. I often go back to a quote from Tim Rogers, someone who probably makes the best game videos on YouTube and that you should definitely check out because he's way smarter than I am. He tells a story how the first man in line on Final Fantasy XII's release day was asked to say something to the camera, to express his feelings about being the first person on Earth to hold this brand new entry in the Final Fantasy series. As if he had been practicing for this moment for years, he turned to the camera and deadass said, standing next to the man who painstakingly made the game he just purchased, "Please remake Final Fantasy VII." Why was the timing of this important? Well, obviously no one was asking for a 7 remake on PS1, and Final Fantasy X was in development before people even knew you could put a 2 at the end of the word PlayStation. It wasn't until about 12 came out when 7 Remake's influence would begin to seep into Square Enix. The Final Fantasy XIII team wasn't locked in a box separated from the rest of the world. They knew how much people demanded a Final Fantasy VII Remake. Before its official announcement in 2015, demand was skyrocketing over it, especially fueled by the fact that Square Enix would put out a cutscene of the train mission as a tech demo for the PlayStation 3 in 2005. Side note, why would you do this for a game you had no intention of making at the time? That's not just kicking the beehive, that's taking the beehive, cutting a hole in the bottom and wearing it as a hat. Then for good measure, punching the bees. It was because of this tech demo, Final Fantasy XIII's production would be moved from PS2 to PS3. Even still, it was no secret in the Square Enix offices which game people really wanted. Imagine as a creator, you want to move forward and take this series in a new direction, but the thing people really want is something your company made over a decade ago. I mean, the sheer demand for a 7 remake in particular could probably cause a crisis at existential levels. What's the point of making new thing if people just want old thing? You might already know that 13 has a long history of being compared to 7. The techno-future setting, the anti-government stance of the characters. I mean, if I had 10 cents for every time someone called Lightning female Cloud, I could probably buy an unopened can of the Final Fantasy XIII energy drink off eBay. I wouldn't drink it, because I'm struggling to think of a worse way to die, but it'd be nice to keep on the shelf until decades of fermenting turns it into a makeshift grenade. But I digress. What I'm trying to get at is, I think 13 was made to be the proverbial Final Fantasy VII killer in Square Enix. The game was designed to be similar enough to 7 for fans to draw comparisons, but they wanted it to be so good, no one would even need a 7 remake anymore. I'm not saying it was designed by committee cobbled together for the direct purpose of slapping the 7 desires straight out of people's brains, but consciously or not, it feels like a lot of things in this game were made with the intent of, now how can we make this better than 7? The game constantly feels like it's trying to one-up something. It's hard to explain, but if you play it for yourself and keep an eye out for it, I think you'll see what I'm getting at. This design philosophy would obviously end up hurting the game in the long run, damaging its identity. That being said, I think we're to blame as well. Not like you or me specifically, I mean the collective we. Like I said, Final Fantasy VII Remake demand was at a zenith. Showing that PS3 tech demo was like one of those plot devices where a dude summons a monster and loses control of it. Before you ask, yes, I'm thinking about Final Fantasy X again. In 2009, people didn't want Fabula Nova Crystallis. They didn't want a bunch of loosely related spin-offs. They wanted 7 Remake. Anything that came out under the perceived level of quality people thought 7 Remake would be was torn apart. Of course, we as individuals wanted new games, but the collective mass slamming Square with emails weren't the people asking them to continue exactly as they were doing, you know what I'm saying? When 13 released, it dropped like a red balloon in a bullpit. I went over all the changes it made to the RPG genre in the gameplay section of the video, and while I don't think they're awful changes in retrospect, look at them again while remembering the collective demand for a 7 remake that lived up to the expectation that everyone set out for it. People hated the changes 13 made to the RPG genre, and there was a big worry that those changes could become the standard. Looking back now like Olympus gods with time machines, we know that this wasn't what happened, but put yourself in the shoes of someone at the time. This caused pushback over 13 to spill over the edge. It was doomed to be received in a time where emotions were flaring high. 13 isn't a standout of the series, sure, but irreconcilable trash? I don't know about that. It's at least the third best JRPG on Xbox 360, or something. You're free to express your personal taste over the changes the game made to the RPG genre. I know I sure have, and I think there's a lot of room for debate. While I don't agree with a lot of the changes 13 made, I don't think they tank the game. And I at least think it makes for an interesting game to play, because you can't find the stuff 13 does anywhere else. This reception started a snowball effect that ended up like the metaphor with the monkeys and the banana on the ladder. After being told for so many years not to touch 13, no one does, with the original reasons why not mattering anymore. I mean, hell, Square Enix won't even touch it. I'm not exaggerating when I say every single other Final Fantasy has had a formal re-release except this one. While I think it's great that it's been put on PC, given its all-time peak of 8,000 players, it's safe to say not many people revisited their opinions on this one when it dropped. I doubt for the past 10 years a single human being has come across and played Final Fantasy XIII before stumbling upon its reputation. And I've seen stuff like this happen before. Am I saying if 13 suddenly got a lot of eyes on it now it'd be the stealth best game in the series? No, not even close. But you can at least see where I'm going with this. And believe me when I say I'm not ragging on 7 Remake. While my thoughts on that game are long and complex, and no, we can't get into it now, have you seen the length of this video? The actual game itself has nothing to do with this. When I'm talking about the years 2005 to 2015, when I say Final Fantasy VII Remake, I'm talking about some theoretical daydream game that didn't even exist at the time. That's how big of a shadow the hype for that game cast. To sum this all up, I think the timing of Final Fantasy XIII's release played a not non-insignificant factor in its reception. It's not anyone or any game's fault, it's just the way it was in the late 2000s. Maybe, just maybe, it deserves another chance to be looked at with fresh eyes. I know I've definitely benefited from the experience. Particularly if you like 7 Remake, the, real 7 Remake I mean. It might be worth checking out just to see where the DNA for that game came from. But I mean, I wouldn't blame you if you don't. Square Enix certainly looks like they don't want to touch it again. After a trilogy of 13 games, that's 3 Final Fantasy XIII games, not a trilogy made up of 13 games. Yeah, I don't know, it's confusing. The developers would wash their hands of that number completely and move on to 7 Remake. Never looking back. Oh, right. We still got a whole ending of the game to go over here, don't we? Almost forgot about that, what with the whole, thing. We've gone over pretty much everything else at this point, so all that's left to talk about is how the story plays out. I won't take too much time with it since I've kept you around for a long enough time already, but if you've decided to play the game for yourself, go to this timestamp if you want to remain spoiler-free. Got it? Alright, they're gone. It's just me and you 3 fellas now. Hope and Lightning return to his hometown where they meet Fang, our 6th main character. She reveals that her and Vanille are actually Pulse l'Cie from the lower world village Verba, from centuries ago. During the war transgression, they were given a focus to transform into the great beast Ragnarok and destroy Cocoon. Due to Vanille having strong pull-out game and bailing at the last second, they only managed to crack its surface, which is why Cocoon has a wound, scar thing on it. Their focus technically complete, they're turned into crystal until the fal'Cie decides they need him to have another go at it, which was conveniently enough 13 days ago. Vanille wakes up with her memories, but Fang doesn't. Vanille keeps their task a secret, since she's not too keen on doing the whole try to kill millions of innocent people thing again. Fast forward to present day, Vanille puts 2 and 2 together from Saz's stories that she's the reason his son was turned into a l'Cie. When this is revealed to him by the queen of underused villains who cares what's her name, he confronts her. Ultimately, he decides against capping her with his Lego guns, but the pair are captured. Fang sees live footage saying that the pair are going to be executed, so the team mounts a rescue mission. After busting them out, they're riding pretty high right now. Things seem to be going right for them. It's on their escape, they run into Primarch Daisley, the leader of Cocoon. The Pope reveals himself to be the fal'Cie Barthandelus, and explains to them that their series of W's on their attempt to change their fate was actually a carefully crafted path laid out before them. Sit down for this one. While the Cocoon fal'Cie said they were building Cocoon as a paradise for humans, they actually had an ulterior motive. Surprise, right? Cocoon was meant to be a human factory of sorts. Remember, I said that fal'Cie and humans are beings made from the same creator. Humans have the ability to grow and evolve, fal'Cie were all-powerful but stagnant. To call Mummy Dearest back into the world, the FFXIII planned to raise a massive human population on Cocoon, then destroy it. The mass sacrifice would shove the gates of the afterlife open and call the Maker back into the world. The time to crack that shit like an egg had come up, but the problem is, by nature of being Cocoon FFXIII, they couldn't destroy Cocoon directly. Instead, they used that dormant Pulse FFXIII from the first chapter to create l'Cie, whose focus was to destroy Cocoon, who they would then guide towards that goal from the shadows. Our 6 protagonists are those Pulse l'Cie, and upon being told this, they start to lose their nerve, especially Snow, who realized that when Sarah was turned to crystal by completing her focus, that focus wasn't to protect Cocoon like he believed it was. It was to bring together the people that could destroy it. After beating this game's version of Sid, there he is by the way, say hello, they find a ship with the ability to go to Pulse. They decide to opt out of the whole destroy Cocoon or become a creature deal, and with Pulse being the place the FFXIII that cursed them originated from, they figure they can find a way to remove the brands there. So, the gang heads to Jurassic Pulse, which is, as advertised, a savage world where the beasts rule and the strong eat the weak.
Help me! Help me!
They came here to solve their l'Cie issue, but they're coming up empty at every turn. Their brands have almost progressed to their final stage, and it's clear they've only got enough time to try about one more thing before it's lights out. Vanille and Fang suggest they try heading to Erba, and given that it seems to be their best bet, they make the journey. I'm gonna level with ya, Erba is such a great area, man. It's some of the best environmental storytelling in the entire series. You see, while you journeyed across Pulse, you occasionally came up against Seath enemies, but Erba is full of them. After Vanille and Fang failed to destroy Cocoon, the Pulse FFXIII must have started getting desperate. They started mass l'Cieing entire populations, but with no means to destroy Cocoon after losing the war, the people would have no choice but to sit back and wait to turn. The Pulse FFXIII didn't care. Humans meant nothing to them. They just wanted to win their war. Walking around Erba, you get the sense that the people of Pulse, people you've been told are savage monsters that are the total antithesis to everything the peaceful Cocoon stands for, aren't actually all that different. You walk around their kitchens to see how they ate. You find their toys, Vanille's vacuum cleaner thing. You walk around their schools, you see the remains of their trains and highways, and it all just shows how literally normal their lives were. But it doesn't matter now. They're all gone. The people of Cocoon live in fear of an enemy that doesn't even exist anymore. And think about that for a second. Remember how I said this was a depressing post-apocalyptic-esque nightmare world? Other than the people of Cocoon, humanity is essentially extinct. If the Cocoon FFXIII go through with their plan, humanity will be completely and totally wiped out. The best part is that this is all told to the player through the environment. There's no melodramatic flashback or anything to shove it in your face. There's no scene where Lightning looks at the camera and goes, "We really are the last of us," or anything like that. You're given all the details, and you gotta put the reality of the situation together yourself. Is Final Fantasy XIII the Dark Souls of JRPGs? Someone call that It's Like Dark Souls Twitter account over here. Both sides of humanity, Cocoon and Pulse, were ruled by cruel gods, sustaining them, but ultimately robbing them of their fates. Barthandelus appears to the party in Pulse, and getting desperate, he reveals that since they won't play along, he set up a series of events that'll throw Cocoon into civil war using Sid as a puppet, forgoing his need for them and its destruction. The party gets the sense that they're being manipulated into returning, but they decide if they're gonna die, they might as well do it protecting their home, and they go back to Cocoon. The key to destroying Cocoon is to destroy the FFXIII that rests at its core, Orphan, so they head there to stop it from being taken out in the chaos. Once they get there, though, they learn that this goes way further than a few FFXIII wanting to reunite with Mummy. Orphan itself was created only with the purpose to die and summon the Maker, meaning Cocoon to its core was created from the ground up to be destroyed. The party decides that there ain't no way for humanity and FFXIII to coexist, and raise their arms against Barthandelus, who merges with Orphan, turning into this weird mother, father, son type thing. You fight the boss, who they gave an instant kill attack in a game where if your party leader dies, it's game over. Ah yes, I love SMT, but it eventually gets the upper hand. The party starts seething out, save for Vanille and Fang, with Orphan torturing the former to force the latter to turn into Ragnarok and destroy Cocoon. Fang, figuring that the FFXIII have never lied to her before or something, starts the transformation, but is too weak to make a dent alone. She's eventually called back when the illusion fades and the party stands with her, resolute in their goal. They stop Fang from destroying Orphan and therefore destroying Cocoon by reversing her transformation, so they can destroy Orphan, and therefore destroy Cocoon. Like, is walking away not an option, or what? Whatever. After the final boss is defeated, Cocoon starts falling apart, and I guess at this point our characters realize they might have done a big oopsie and not had a plan for it. Vanille and Fang decide to take the L to save everyone else and transform into Ragnarok, but instead of destroying Cocoon, they create a crystal pillar to break its fall. Oh, hey look everyone, it's the logo! They manage to succeed, avoiding a literal humanity-ending disaster, but as a result, are trapped in the crystal pillar for eternity. The other four are safe on the ground in Pulse and are reunited with their loved ones. They decide to honor their friend's sacrifice by living as free humans, no longer shackled by the uncaring will of the fal'Cie, creating a new home for themselves on Pulse. Strengthened by their resolve, they look forward to their future, a future filled with hope and endless possibilities. And then lightning falls down a hole and disappears! I wish I was joking. Just gonna wait a sec for the no spoiler people to come back. But we'll talk about that shit next time. I'm pretty familiar to how Final Fantasy has evolved over the years. It's an incredibly important series to me, and it likely is to a lot of you as well. Is 13 gonna be on the top of a list of the best Final Fantasy games? No, I don't think it is. It made a lot of changes to the RPG genre, as was thought necessary at the time. But innovations don't get a free pass to being good just because they're different. Instead, I think 12 years later, what is important is fairly evaluating these differences and which are positive or negative, especially since we know now that they wouldn't become the standard like was feared at the time. For a variety of complex reasons, some legitimate, the gut reaction to 13 was strongly negative. Playing it now, it's almost hard to believe that it was and still is considered to be a terrible game that no one should touch. I don't even think it's at the bottom of the mainline Final Fantasy series. A group of 15 mainline games where even the worst one is still at least a 7 out of 10. I know that doesn't sound like heaping praise, and I'm trying not to give 13 too much credit here, but let me put it this way. Final Fantasy XIII is an underrated game that was mostly a victim of circumstance and a troubled development. There's some stuff to dislike, sure, but there's a lot of stuff here that's pretty good as well. And from trends I'm seeing online, I think more and more people are slowly coming around to that idea. Do I think Final Fantasy XIII is gonna have some huge renaissance and finally dethrone God of War and some pole IGN slimes out? Nah, I'm not expecting some Phantom Thieves change your heart shit to happen. Do I think you should play Final Fantasy XIII? Well, it's complicated. If you're someone who only finishes 10 games a year or so, maybe you should give it a pass. If what I've said today interests you, and you're alright going into a game you know isn't perfect, then I'd say what do you have to lose? Sometimes, I think we gotta play a flawed game or two. It can really give a perspective that you won't get if you only smash out games that score over 90 on Metacritic. My Final Fantasy XIII back-of-the-box quote is, "This game ain't perfect, but I sure did like it." Lastly, if you've made it this far and are still watching, thanks. This is a passion project that I put a shit ton of effort into. Probably more than I should have. The fact you stuck around to hear this means a lot. I'm gonna do Final Fantasy XIII 2 and Lightning Returns as well, but those videos aren't gonna come close to the length of this one. 13-2 is a game I remember detesting when it came out, but it seems a lot of people think it's the best in the trilogy or something? We'll see how I feel after a replay of it. Drop a cheeky little sub if you want to keep up with that. Anyways, that's all for today. Till next time.